I'm Corbin Smith. It's time for another Seahawks Central Radio show alongside Tad Hensinger. It's been a busy week for the Seahawks, including a blockbuster deal for Earl Thomas, the standout safety. He signed a 4-year, $40 million extension to return to the Seahawks that'll go through 2017. Tad, what are your initial thoughts on this move? Obviously a big move for the franchise, looking at staying a contender long term.
I think it's actually a really great deal. I think it's really no surprise to virtually anybody that they lock Thomas up long term. He is one of the key young players on that entire team, let alone the defense. It's worth every single penny and then some that they gave him. He is now going to be the richest safety in football, 4 years, $40 million, a little over 27.5 guaranteed. That's a big payday for him, and he is only 24, turning 25 this upcoming week. So it's going to lock him up until he's about 29, when he'll be in line for another big payday probably. So the future looks bright for Seattle as far as this goes. You and I have talked earlier in the week, Corb, and I think we're both kind of in agreement that Thomas is the quarterback of that defense. He's the one. Richard Sherman's important, the linebackers, the defensive linemen, but Earl Thomas is the guy that makes that defense go and be as effective as it is. The guy actually kind of reminds me in the sense of Ed Reed and all those great Ravens defenses, in the sense that his coverage abilities free up everyone else to play either really physical at the line, like the corners, or it allows Cam Chancellor to go down into the box and play as an extra linebacker, essentially. So I love the deal, and I think Seattle's going to be reaping the benefits for a few years to come here.
The Seahawks, we know they run that cover 3 patented defense. It's actually pretty simple. When you think about the results that they've had, the results have been pretty good considering how simple the defense is. And Earl Thomas is really the captain of the defense. And his ability to roam center field in the back half of the defense for the Seahawks, it really provides some flexibility for Seattle defensively, because guys like Richard Sherman and Byron Maxwell, as good of players as they are, we know Sherman is pretty much the best corner in the league, and he's promoted himself that way. But we know that Sherman didn't boast about that, and his stats back it up. Led the league with 8 picks last year. But when Earl Thomas was asked at his press conference yesterday about why those corners, those big corners like Sherman and Maxwell, were able to find so much success, he pretty much said number 29 is the reason. He was talking about himself, and he said, I'm not trying to boast, but it's true. And when you look at the film, it is the truth, because Earl Thomas has the ability to close up so much of the field by himself because of his speed and his instincts that it makes it that Sherman, Lane, Browner, when he was with the Seahawks, were able to get into press coverage. They were able to play physically at the line, and they could play the risk that if this guy gets by me, Earl Thomas is going to be ready to back me up because he does such a great job with that. It's difficult to throw over the top. Against a cover 3 defense, that's normally a strength for the opposing team. You want to try to go deep. But Earl Thomas is so gifted that opponents really have a tough time doing that. The only team last year that really had a great deal of success going over the top and sustained it for an entire game was the Indianapolis Colts. We saw what Andrew Luck did, especially throwing to T.Y. Hilton, but that was the only game where that happened.
Yeah, and I think I like your point there about the cover 3 and what it allows the other guys to do. In my opinion, the way you set up a great defense is one of 2 ways. You either have a great secondary, a great back half of the defense that allows players to come up and play the run a little bit more or play the short a little bit more and take that away, or you have a great front 7 that can terrorize the quarterback and decimate at the point of attack. In this case, the Seahawks have both, so it works out. But Thomas really, and I like your point about what he said in his press conference, he's not really cocky or arrogant. He's just factual. He's just, this is how it is. I am self-aware of what I bring to the table. And I think that's a good quality in that he's so grounded, which really helps considering how good that defense is. His ability to play the deep third of the field there, deep half of the field, depending on the coverage, especially if it's that cover 3, like you said, it allows those corners to come up and play physical because they know they've got a little help over the top. And with his speed and range, he makes up for a lot of mistakes in that front 7 there. And it also, when he's got that deep third to deep half just locked up, that takes away all the short options too. And so really, you're looking at maybe the intermediate passes, which are not exactly high percentage throws, allows Cam Chancellor to come up, and that's why Seattle's so good against the run. They're essentially playing with 8 guys in the box on a consistent basis.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the value of Thomas, it's not just in his ability to defend the pass. He's also a great asset in the run game, just by the fact that he allows Seattle to have so much flexibility moving Chancellor up. He's basically adding another linebacker who can also drop into coverage, and you'd like to do that with a guy like Chancellor, who's 6'3". He's a big man. He's physically imposing. He's built like a linebacker, has the athletic skills of a safety. Thomas's ability to play center field so well, it's just a luxury that other teams in the league really don't have, because when you have all that space that's being closed off by one guy and he can contain that area, it really limits opponents, because when one man has that much impact, you still got 10 other guys on that side of the football, and Seattle's got so much talent at every level of the defense that when you have a player like Thomas is that gifted, and you allow other really good players to have the opportunity to step in and contribute the way that Seattle's players have done, that really provides a lift for the defense, and that's part of the reason that they're so dominant, having Thomas in center field. And then you have another guy like Sherman to talk about. Sherman is one of the best in the business. He's the best corner in football, in my opinion, and of course in his opinion. It looks like his contract is nearing a resolution, and it looks like there's a good chance he's going to be signed before the NFL draft next week. What do you expect Sherman to get in the money range? What are your thoughts?
I think he's going to want top dollar, but at the same time, I think he is also self-aware enough that he's not going to totally try and break the bank, kind of like Darrelle Revis did in the $16 million a year range. I'm thinking we're talking a little more, anywhere from probably 12 to 14 million, somewhere in that range. He's probably going to just be like Thomas and have a pretty big chunk of it guaranteed, considering his production. You mentioned that Sherman, is self-aware that he is the top corner in the game, and most people would agree with that. Not only that, but the statistics back it up. If you look at the statistics from last year and play-by-play basis, he is the best corner in the game. He was graded out as that there are no questions asked. So I really think he's worth every penny, kind of like Thomas did. If there's a number 2 player on that defense that makes it go, I think it's Sherman. And that, like Thomas blocking up the back half of the field, Sherman essentially locks up one side of the field. So if you look at it, you've got 2/3 of the field at least locked down in pass coverage, which frees up, you've got 9 other guys to either get after the quarterback or take up the rest of the passing lanes, which is why Seattle's defense is so difficult. So I really like this, and from all the reports I've been seeing too, you alluded to this as well, it seems like Seattle is really trying to get this done before the draft. Nobody's really exactly clear. There's been no talk of money thrown out other than just speculation, but everything seems to be pointing at they want this done before the draft. That way they know how much money they've got to lock up the rest of their players, like Russell Wilson, who you can guarantee will get a mega contract.
It's all about priorities, Tad, and Seattle knew what their main priority was going into the offseason. They wanted to keep Michael Bennett. Golden Tate was a guy they would like to have come back, but they had a certain value for him, and when he went to Detroit, they felt that Detroit paid more than what it was worth to keep Golden in Seattle, and he was upset about that. He felt like he got undersold, but face the fact, you can't keep everyone, and Seattle was in a position where Tate just took the money, and Seattle just felt he wasn't worth that. And then you have Thomas and Sherman, the guys that can be worked with now, that can be negotiated with. And those 2 guys are the cornerstones of your defense. You want to keep them locked up long term. You want those 2 guys to be wearing navy and green for the rest of their careers. So you're going to do whatever it takes to keep them signed long term, and they want to get that done now. And Sherman, to me, in the $13, $14 million range, it makes sense to bring him back for 4 or 5 years, and then he'll be ready to one-up again when the Seahawks are looking at him at 29, 30 years old. He's going to be just like Earl Thomas and be in a position where he can be negotiated with for another big contract.
Yeah, and that's really the deal with like Golden Tate, and this is an issue Seattle's going to face in the near future, is that you've got all these guys that are going to be coming for a major contract soon. So the issues go and I really think that Golden Tate, he's going to be gone. He's out of there, obviously. He might have been worth what he wanted, but Seattle had to prioritize who they wanted to keep. Thomas and Sherman, I think, were a much higher priority than Golden Tate ever was or will be. I like Golden Tate. I think he's a quality player, but he's nowhere near the priority Sherman, Wilson, Thomas are. So I think this is this kind of strategy you're going to see in the upcoming years, especially. Seattle's going to identify who they really want, who they need, and they're going to go ahead and lock those guys up.
Yeah, this is all about a blueprint. When you're looking at what the Seahawks are doing, they want to be in a position where in the next couple of years, and it's really important next week, I mean, we got the draft coming up, they want to be able to know where are we going to possibly need to find replacements down the road. And if you can lock Thomas and Sherman both up long-term before the draft takes place, you know you don't need to get a guy to replace either one of them. And it really helps with future planning. That's why when teams wait a long time to try to negotiate a deal till the last second, or they let it go through the season and it provides a distraction, I shake my head because I'm wondering, what are you doing? How are you really focusing on the future? Maybe right now it's working, but what is it going to hold for you a year or two down the road from now? I think Seattle is handling this perfectly, especially if Sherman gets locked up. There's no guarantees it's going to happen before the draft, but it looks really highly probable that Seattle is going to be able to make that move. And speaking of this blueprint, the Seahawks are in a position where, you and I have discussed this, receiver still appears to be the biggest need, and this draft class is so loaded at wide receiver. We've covered top prospects like Brandon Cooks, Marquise Lee. We've talked about guys like Latimer from Indiana. These guys are all standout college receivers that could be high-impact players for the Seahawks right away. But if the Seahawks decide not to go wide receiver with pick number 32, or even in the other early round pick in the second round, they've got to start looking potentially at the defensive line. Chris Clemens is now gone. They released him. Red Bryant is gone. They released him. Both those guys went to the Jaguars. They've still got Cliff Averill, and they've still got Michael Bennett, obviously. So those two guys are key cogs of the end spots. But unless somebody like Benson Mayoya comes in and contributes this year as a second-year player, the depth's kind of shaky there. So defensive end looks like a spot, maybe even defensive tackle. They lost Clinton McDonald. He signed a contract with the Buccaneers. So the defensive line as a whole, they don't necessarily need starters, but they really need some depth guys that they can build up, develop, and can eventually be starters for a team that's going to have to let some guys go. The first major prospect that we are going to look at, and I had a guy on Twitter the other day that was messing with me because you already know how much I love Brandon Cooks, and he played at Oregon State. But Scott Crichton, defensive end from Oregon State, I'm really high on him. And if I had it in a perfect world, I would like to see both of the Beavers kind of make Seattle turn into Beaver North, because I really would like to see Crichton and Cooks both in a Seahawks uniform. But that's not going to happen. They're both going to be gone before that can happen. So Crichton's another guy to look at pick number 32. What are some of the strengths that this guy brings to the table? You and I view him a little bit differently as far as strengths are concerned, but what do you see when you watch film on Scott Crichton, the star defensive end for Oregon State?
I see a very solid game. He's not super flashy. Like, he's not going to burn past your offensive tackles at the snap of the ball and just obliterate them. His size isn't anything to just jump off the charts at you, but he just seems like he's one of those players that will have a quiet 10 to 15-year career, depending how his body holds up, and he'll surprise you and be up there probably top 20 in the sack list and the overall production list, because he just seems to get stuff done. A quality career at Oregon State. One of the things that I like, he's not the fastest guy, only in the about 4.84 range, which for a defensive end, people looking defensive end in a 3.4, that's not too bad. Actually pretty solid, but his get off the ball, his burst is pretty solid, and that's arguably more important than straight line speed in the NFL, because you can make a living with the acceleration you've got. If you can get off the snap real quick, if you can get into the offensive tackle before he's ready for you, you can create some real issues. And especially with this guy, he's got a high motor. He will just and go and go. So he might not have the absolute high-end athleticism you want, but he's going to play his heart out 110% every single snap, and he's going to just give you everything he's got. And honestly, I think that fits the mold of the Seattle Seahawks defense, especially what Pete Carroll's trying to do there. Next man up, we're going to create atmosphere of competition. So I think Crichton would be a good fit. First round, that's a little iffy on that sort of sense, but I really like him. I think he would be a good fit in Seattle, maybe maybe a year or two down the road to be a starter.
Yeah, Crichton doesn't have that jump off the screen type game, like somebody like Bruce Irvin had coming out of West Virginia. He kind of had that bounce off the TV, really exciting looking player. But when you look at Scott Crichton, he's a guy that puts up good numbers, and he does an adequate job against both the run and the pass. He plays with violent hands. He's not a household name. Not a lot of people know about him. When you think defensive ends in this draft class, there's Jadeveon Clowney, and then there's pretty much everyone else. But Crichton's a guy I think you could put in consideration for the second best overall defensive end in this class, because when you look at what he brings to the table, he's a guy that can get by defensive or offensive linemen with rip moves. He's powerful. He can bull rush from the end spot. He's a great tackler in space, so he's able to get in the backfield and locate people, and he's able to bring down ball carriers. He's knocked a lot of tackles, and he's equally as good at chasing down quarterbacks. He's a guy that you can look at as a defensive coordinator, and there's a lot of different options for you. You can keep him in more plays than, say, a guy like I'm looking at this class, somebody like Stephon Tuitt, who is probably going to be better as a run situation defensive lineman and probably won't be as effective as a pass rusher as what somebody like Crichton, who you can keep in for more snaps in the game. Seattle's been adamant that Michael Bennett's going to see a lot more snaps this year than what he saw last year, and it has a lot to do with the fact that he's versatile. He can move down and play the 5 technique as well as the end spot. And that versatility is going to allow him to see more snaps, especially in pass rushing situations when they can drop him down to the 5 tech. But he's going to get more snaps. They're still going to need some bodies there. And Scott Crichton's a guy, because he can play well against the run and he can also rush the passer, I think there's more situations that he's going to be able to contribute right away. Even though he only played 3 years at Oregon State, he's very seasoned. He's experienced. The guy knows how to play. He's got good instincts. We've talked about that high motor. A lot of the ends in this class don't really have that consistently, and I think that's what really stands out to me watching the film. As far as weaknesses, you talked about the lack of speed. He ran a 4.84 at the combine, and that's not a terrible number, but for a defensive end that in a league that we now are seeing a lot of ends drop back in coverage, that speed might not be great when he's asked to drop back in coverage. I could see a team, though, like Seattle, coming in and picking him up and using him primarily as a defensive end because of his ability to stop both the run and the pass, and they wouldn't have to worry about him as dropping in coverage. He'd be more situational. If you know that there's going to be a need for the defensive end to drop back, don't have him in the game. Use him for what he's good at, and that's what Pete Carroll does best. He knows how to put players in a situation where they can maximize their talents, and he would do that with a guy like Scott Crichton, and he'd put him in a position where he would be successful with his skill set.
I kind of want to move on here to a little bit of a guy you mentioned just a little bit when you were talking about Crichton, is Stephon Tuitt out of Notre Dame. You mentioned him a little bit and how he might not quite be the pass rusher that Crichton could be because of the athleticism a little bit there in the motor, and you really touched on the motor with some of these guys. Tuitt is 6'5", 304 pounds. That's a big boy right there. And he's got 31 bench reps there, so he is one of the stronger defensive tackles in this game. His career at Notre Dame, and you've mentioned this in previous shows here, that I've watched plenty of Notre Dame in my time being from Indiana, and Notre Dame defensive end Stephon Tuitt is kind of an enigma. His sophomore year, he was lights out. It seemed like he was bullying offensive tackles. He was in the backfield, smacking the running back, putting him on his butt. And then you got him all in the quarterback's face, either disrupting the timing, putting the quarterback into the dirt, or getting his hands up in the passing lane. Junior year rolls around, and I couldn't quite figure it out. I know he did have a hernia surgery in the offseason between sophomore and junior year, so that did play an issue maybe in a little bit of his conditioning because he came into camp, end of the season, about 20 pounds overweight. So his production dropped off from his sophomore to his junior year. But what I like about him, and he has been linked to the Seahawks at the number 32 spot, this guy, when he's got it going on, he is a monster to stop. I can't tell you how many plays, particularly in his sophomore year, when he seemed to have it going, that it was like he was playing a man amongst mere boys. And if Pete Carroll can harness that, it kind of comes to mind similar to Bruce Irvin maybe a little bit. If Pete Carroll can harness that, you've got a guy who has the potential to be a 5 technique on a regular basis in the 3-4 spot, defensive end spot, and then you've got him on passing situations, he can move into the nose. This is a guy that if you can harness that, whatever that special traits he's got, he's big, strong, he's a physical specimen, he could be disruptive for years to come. Now, I do want to put a qualification there. He has had a fracture in his foot that he had foot surgery for actually during the draft, March 1st, the combine leading up to the draft. And so we don't actually know how fast he is, how athletic he is as far officially, but it does jump out on film a little bit that when he's good to go, he can get after the quarterback for a man that size.
Yeah, no doubt. Tuitt is very versatile, and I think that's what makes him the most ideal to the Seahawks at pick number 32. Todd McShay for ESPN is actually the guy that has Tuitt going to the Seahawks with that draft pick, and his main reasoning is, like you said, that versatility, his ability to play end and also drop down, and he can go across the center because of his size and his strength. From a potential standpoint, I would say that Tuitt probably when you're looking at potential ceiling, we talked about Crichton. I think Crichton's a better player right now, but if you're looking at a guy that really has a high ceiling that could become an elite player, Tuitt has what it takes if the motor can be harnessed, so to speak, if they can get more out of him on a consistent basis. And Pete Carroll could be the guy to do that. We've seen what he's done with guys like Bruce Irvin. We've seen what he's done with lesser talents. You give him a guy like Tuitt who's got that incredible size. He's pretty athletic for that size. And there's definitely film that shows he's more than capable of being a disruption in both the run and pass game. There's a lot of film out there that shows that, and I agree with you. The measurables right now, we don't really know what this guy can do because he's been battling that foot fracture, so who knows if that heals up, he might be able to run the 40 much faster than what people noticed when he was battling through this injury. So without the measurables, you're kind of playing a little bit of a risky game going with him at number 32. But that rare blend of size, speed, strength, athleticism, it just doesn't come along very often. And like I said, Clowney's kind of in the upper tier by himself when you're looking at potential. There's question marks surrounding him, but I can't see how the Texans would not draft him unless somebody trades them like 4 or 5 really high draft picks to get up to that spot and takes Clowney instead. But he seems to me to be almost a consensus number 1 pick at that position. But Tuitt has all the talent in the world. It comes down to, is Pete Carroll going to be able to, if the Seahawks draft him, is he going to be able to get the most out of this guy? And if there's a coach in the league that can do that, it is Pete Carroll. My other major concern with Tuitt, and you and I have talked about this with various players, I could see him being a guy who, if he has a couple really good seasons to start his career, I could see him slacking off a little bit because of complacency. I would be concerned about that, especially after what I saw. I know he was injured, but what he had happened before his junior year at Notre Dame, I'd be concerned that that would happen at the National Football League level, and he'd come to camp one of those seasons really out of shape, and then what do you do with a guy like that? Carroll doesn't want to deal with all that drama. Every training camp, Tuitt, you're 20 pounds heavier than we'd like you to be. They don't want to put up with that. I'd be scared. Not saying that that's a guarantee. Maybe Tuitt could come in and just be great and continue it because of Carroll's presence and the chemistry that this football team has. But that'd be something I'd be concerned about, a fluctuating weight with Tuitt, especially looking at what happened to him last year.
Yeah, I think your point about the weight is valid. However, I will say I think part of that has to do with the surgery. Because he didn't go from his freshman to his sophomore year and really have these sort of issues. So I think that was at least partially played up by the surgery, the fact that he was unable to do his normal offseason conditioning. And it was probably hard for a man of that size to get back into it. Now, the real question is going to be that will, I think, kind of identify if that's a concern is when he gets drafted, wherever he gets drafted, Seattle or not, how does he come into the rookie mini camps, the OTAs, training camps? If he comes in overweight and out of shape, then I think you can really start to say, hey, we've got a problem here with this guy as far as his work ethic and conditioning and keeping himself in shape. But you mentioned Crichton. Crichton's a little more NFL ready than Tuitt. I want to agree and disagree at the same time. If you get sophomore year Stephon Tuitt, he is hands down a better player, and I do think he's more NFL ready at the defensive end position. If you get junior year Stephon Tuitt, Crichton's ready to step in a lot sooner than Tuitt, and Tuitt's going to have to get himself in shape a little better and get himself ready to play a little bit better. So I'm split on that. It really just depends which Stephon Tuitt is going to show up. And we've talked about this a little bit. His motor can run a little hot and cold, which isn't necessarily what you want out of your first-round pick. Your first-round pick is somebody you see sitting there, okay, this guy is going to contribute. If not immediately, he's going to be a key role player and start within a year or two and be a consistent starter year in and year out. Tuitt, as you said, we don't really know for sure. He didn't get to show off his athleticism because of the foot fracture. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. And so I think Seattle might jump on him, but they also might look to trade back down if there's not a receiver there that they want.
Yeah, and I think you look at the Seahawks, another guy he's kind of one of those players you either love him or you hate him, and that is Coney Eagley out of Missouri. And this guy's an intriguing prospect. I've watched a lot of film on him. He's got good size, and it's funny, he was barely over 200 pounds when he arrived at Missouri. So, this dude's packed on a lot of weight since he got to college. He's 6'4", 273 pounds. He's got solid athletic ability to go with it. He had a solid statistical season at Missouri a year ago, but they're not eye-popping. It's not one of those like, oh my gosh, he had 20 sacks in one season, or even 10. It's not like Ealy's a guy that's putting up numbers that just make you think, oh, that's a surefire first-rounder. But the film says, there's some first-round talent here if you really take a close look. As we talked with Crichton, the Seahawks really are looking for guys who can play inside and out. That's one concern with Crichton is, he's only a little over 270 pounds, much like what Ealy is. And the concern with him is, can he drop down and play defensive tackle? Probably not. Even though Ealy's not really much bigger, he seems like he is a better fit to drop down as a tackle. He's a more physically demanding player, so to speak. He's a little stronger. He's going to get into the trenches, and that's really where he excels. He's not a guy that you're going to see drop back in coverage, but he's a real run stuffer. Ealy and Crichton are about the same grade when you're looking at their ability to stuff the run, tackle ball carriers in the backfield. I think the difference here, at least for me, and I know that you have different viewpoints on this, but I think Crichton is a better prospect as a player who can chase after the quarterback than what Ealy is. But I would say they're about on equal footing. Maybe Ealy's a teeny bit better when it comes to stopping the run, but I would give Crichton the easy advantage as a pass rusher, at least from the film that I've watched. They'd have a similar grade against the run. A little different when you look at their ability to chase after the passer.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think they're roughly equal as far as stopping the run. You could kind of flip a coin depending a little bit who you prefer as far as actually stopping the run, who comes out on top. Pass rushing, Crichton, I give him the edge, especially with that motor. He is a little more athletic. Ealy, though, here's the thing with me, and some of you 12s out there might have heard this term before from some of the draft analysts analyzing prospects recently. I see him as a bit of a tweener. He's got good size. He's got, for an outside linebacker, neighborhood of 6'4", 273. As you mentioned, he's put on about 65 pounds since his freshman year. But what I see the issue is here, he's not really athletic enough to play outside linebacker. By the same token, though, he's also not going to be a great five-technique defensive end. He's a little small. He's got the size is okay, but he's probably getting pushed around by more physical offensive linemen. So what I see his best fit being probably second or third round pick, and he puts on 10 to 15 pounds of muscle, moves down to a defensive spot, and then I think once he learns the nuances of that, I think he can be a contributor and more of an impact player from that position because it's going to kind of mask his lack of athleticism.
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting thought, and he's a guy that could continue to grow into that body. Being 6'4", he's got a good frame to add some more muscle, and I think he's a guy who, when you look at his skill set, he would be best on a team that's going to run a 3-4 and be a 3-4 defensive end because he has played some tackle down at Missouri. He played some defensive tackle. I can't see in a 4-3 him being a guy that can drop down and do that. But as far as weaknesses are concerned, I see some things here that could be red flags. That 4.92 40, it doesn't seem like that's much different than the 4.84 that Crichton ran, but I can't see him being a guy that's going to be able to drop back into coverage. That's why I look at him in the 3-4 as a down defensive end, a guy that he needs to bulk up, like you said, put another 10 to 15 pounds on him, and he's going to be able to grow into his body and be able to contribute as a down lineman in a 3-4 scheme. You can't put him at outside linebacker, though, because I just see too many issues, not enough experience as a coverage person. I don't think he's got the athletic ability to succeed as an outside linebacker in that kind of a scheme. He does get pushed around when he plays more physical offensive linemen. You can see that on film. And being in the SEC, he had a lot of experience playing against really physically imposing big linemen that are good in the trenches. So even though he's really good inside, a guy that really gets mean with him in the trenches is going to have his way with him, and I'd be concerned about that not meshing well with the Seahawks because you got to have a little bit of that nasty attitude to play for Seattle's vaunted defense. Maybe Seattle could get that out of him. I'm just not sure. He's not a guy that has he's got some moves, but he's not a guy who does well staying low out of his stance. He can get stood upright, and you and I both know from playing defensive line, once that happens, it's game over, especially at the pro level. These big offensive linemen that are technically sound, a guy gets stood up, it's game over. That guy's going to be stood in his place, or he's going to end up getting knocked flat on his butt. So I look at some of the fundamental things, and I see some stuff that needs some work for Coney Ely. The bottom line for me is he's a steady defensive end. He's a guy who would be a solid fit for Seattle from a scheme standpoint because he has played both end and tackle. He'd have to bulk up to really fit into Seattle's system, but I think there's some potential there. He had some tough times growing up, so he's fought adversity. He's supposed to be a high-character guy. Missouri's had some other guys that haven't been, but Ely looks like he fits the bill. And defensive line is not an immediate area of need. You're not looking for a starter, but the Seahawks are definitely in a situation where they're looking for depth, like we said with these other guys. Ely's a guy, maybe you could take him at 32, but I agree with you. I think he's a guy you wait till the second round on. Maybe another team takes him in the first round, but I think he's a guy that you need to wait on until the second round.
Yeah, and I like that you brought that point up again because looking at him, I just think he's too much of a tweener. He's too much in that middle ground where you've mentioned that 4.92 speed. It's not the end of the world for a defensive lineman, but he's just not going to be able to drop back into coverage consistently and be effective. Even into the flats, you got to have the burst to get out to the flats and cover those running backs. Imagine him trying to cover a guy like Darren Sproles or LaShawn McCoy, and even a little bit bigger back, Adrian Peterson's athletic enough. He's going to cause real problems for a guy like Ely in coverage, and it's just not going to end well. So I really think his best deal is to bulk up a little bit, move down to defensive end probably, slide inside on passing down to defensive tackle. And Seattle, well, I like Ely. I think he's got, like you said, he's got some moves that are a work in progress, but they're there. And I like him, but the fact that he gets up out of his stance a little bit too high, he's going to get pancaked consistently if he keeps that up. I don't like him in the end of the first round. I think even maybe the end of the second round, I think that's where you start looking maybe. If not, I think if he's there in the third round, still Seattle could go ahead and take a shot at him, and I think that would be a good fit. I really do not like him as a first-round pick, though. I just think there's way too much work that needs to be done to make him a contributor.
Yeah, and another guy, when you look at the Seahawks and their first round needs, they like we talked about, they're missing some defensive tackles. Ended up losing Clinton McDonald to the Buccaneers. Brandon Mebane still there holding down the fort. He's getting up there age-wise for a defensive tackle. He's still probably got a few good years left in him. Definitely not completely out of his prime, but Seattle's in the position. I really like Jesse Williams. We've talked about him on the show. If he can just stay healthy, I really like him playing defensive tackle. But actually think looking at a defensive tackle in the first round would be wise if I felt like there was a guy that was worthy. And I'm just not sure how I feel about Rashid Hageman. I'm not sure how I feel about him, the standout from Minnesota. You and I have both watched a lot of Big Ten games, being guys from the Midwest. We've seen a lot of these teams play, the Golden Gophers included. And depth at defensive tackle, like we said, it's a need, especially if Jesse Williams isn't able to get healthy. But I'm not sure about investing a first-rounder, especially when I don't think the defensive tackle class is all that enticing this year, away from a guy like, say, Aaron Donald, who I expect to be gone in the middle of the first round. And he'll go to a team like, say, Dallas that really needs help up front. I don't think he's going to be available, and I don't expect him to be Seattle to be in a position where he's left. But if Carroll and his staff really are thinking about adding a guy that can be another high-quality player at the defensive tackle position, a guy like Hageman's a guy that, it would be worth a look. I think he might be the best defensive tackle outside of, say, Aaron Donald, or Florida State's got a talented guy as well that's going to go in the first round, Jernigan. I think Hageman will probably be the third guy. The thing about him is he's a physically imposing defensive tackle, and Pete Carroll really likes that. He likes those big maulers that can play inside, guys like what Mebane has been, guys that really plug up space, they're physical inside. He's 6'6", 310 pounds, so he's a big dude. He has the build of a modern offensive lineman, and you know how Seattle likes to get guys that have interesting size measurables that maybe the rest of the league's not looking at for certain positions. Hageman kind of fits for that. He's got elite strength. He can bulldoze into the backfield, and he's able to accelerate quickly for a man of his size. His top speed isn't great, but his acceleration is extremely good. If we were looking at NCAA football, his acceleration is probably in the mid-80s, which for a man his size, that's pretty impressive. His 40-yard dash, just a little over 5 seconds. For a 300-pound man, that's pretty good. Not great, but pretty good. His athleticism should allow him to be versatile for whatever team drafts him. I can see him playing some defensive end in certain situations for a 4-3 team or a 3-4 team because of his size and athleticism. He's got some versatility. He's suited mostly, though, as an interior fixture in the line. So strength-wise, he's a guy that's shown glimpses on film of being a guy that can really be a presence as a run stuffer inside when he brings his A game. Consistency is a little bit of an issue. As far as looking at Hageman, what are your thoughts?
I'm kind of split on this. Don't get me wrong. I think he's got your prototypical defensive tackle size, particularly in a 4-3. He's probably looking at your one technique, or maybe even if he's got the good burst and the athleticism, like if that holds up, like you said, I could see him in the 3 technique maybe. In the 3-4, I do agree he could be the nose and probably passing situations, maybe bump out to defensive end. I like the measurables. The guy is an absolute monster size-wise, but I don't think I think this would be a stretch for Seattle at this point. He's talented, but he's got a lot of risk that comes around with him. He's only had a couple of sacks, 2 to be specific, as a senior for the Golden Gophers. That really concerns me, and not that the Big Ten is pass-heavy by any means, but it just kind of shows that he does not have that it factor as far as getting to the quarterback. A guy like this, 6'6", 310 pounds, he should be able to have his way with a lot of the linemen in the Big Ten, just on pure physical standards, and get to the quarterback. The fact that he didn't kind of worries me. That suggests to me that he's going to be kind of a run stuffer, maybe a situational role player, and I do not think Seattle is going to want to go with that in the first round, especially because he's at this point definitely he's going to be a depth pick in my opinion. So I don't like him in this sense as a first round pick. I think second round or third round you could start looking at it and maybe I'd be a little more comfortable with that. I really think, and this is another reason I don't think Seattle's going to end up going with him. is that you got guys like Tuitt that's up there still, Crichton, and you've also got the obvious need at wide receiver. So I really do not see him getting drafted in the first round at all by Seattle. Maybe the second round. I think third round's when you're really going to start taking a look at this guy because of his measurables. So Corb, anything else to add on him?
Well, Seattle's got Mebane. They've still got Tony McDaniel. We've talked about Jesse Williams bringing a presence if he's healthy. I just don't see the urgency to pick for a defensive tackle in the first couple rounds. I could see picking a guy that's a defensive end that can also drop down, a guy like Tuitt or maybe even Ely or Crichton, guys that have some versatility. I'm just not sure about picking Hageman. For the main reason being it's just not really a need. And I see too much on film that worries me about consistency. There are plays that jump out to me where I think, man, this guy is violent. He's great inside the trenches. He can rip off linemen. He's a good bull rusher. But then I just see plays. I see too many times where it looks like he over pursues or he's not aware of where the football is. And you can't have that in the NFL at any position, let alone defensive tackle. He's able to get by the offensive lineman, his opponent, and suddenly the guy runs right past him, and he could have made a tackle. I've seen that way too many times, and that's especially evident when he's chasing after the quarterback. It almost seems like if the quarterback starts to move away, he just kind of slows down. His pursuit's not there. That goes back to motor. It's not there consistently. That just doesn't seem to me like the kind of guy that you want to pick with the 32nd pick.
Yeah, and I like what you mentioned there about just the fact that he doesn't seem to have that. He doesn't have that closing burst. And Seattle, what the thing I like about their defense is they have finishers. They have guys that if the ball carrier has been wrapped up and he's still standing there fighting for it, you have a guy like, you really pick a guy on that defense. He's going to come in, smack him, put him on the ground. Hageman, I don't really see that, and you mentioned that, he gets close to the quarterback, but the quarterback starts moving away, and he just kind of slows down and lacks that finishing edge. Another reason I don't like this being the pick for Seattle here is actually yesterday wrote a brief article. There have been reports that in free agency, former Minnesota Vikings defensive tackle Kevin Williams has been in for a visit. Now, Williams is 33, definitely getting towards the point. He's probably past his prime, but he's still got probably a couple more solid seasons in him. So I think this is going to be another factor. If they want to sign Williams, that's going to provide that depth. Williams has been healthy. He's never played in less than 14 games in any one of his 11 seasons. And 8 out of his 11 seasons, he's played in all 16 games. So I think if Seattle definitely goes that route and adds him in free agency, you will not see a defensive tackle drafted unless it's a guy like Tuitt would probably be the number one off the board for Seattle, followed by Crichton, in my opinion. So I don't really see this being a need until, as you mentioned, in probably rounds 3, maybe 4, where they'll look to add some depth and developmental players.
Yeah, and that's exactly where you look for those type of players. And I think when it's not an urgent need, you need to put it on the side, see what kind of prospects there are that are maybe a little further down the ladder that you got a better opportunity to draft maybe 5th or 6th round even. I just don't see – I see end being greater need for getting a second depth type guy that's right behind Averill and Bennett. I just don't think defensive tackle – there's quite as much of a need there. I wouldn't stretch with it with a first-round pick, especially for a guy like Hageman. That a lot of upside, but there's also a lot of things that really kind of scare me when I look at his game film as far as the motor and pursuit. Now, Tad, you and I, we talked briefly about the schedule last week. Now we've had more time to actually look at the Seahawks 2014 schedule, and after spending more time sitting there looking at what was released last Wednesday, I was a little bit surprised because Seattle actually has 4 primetime games. You and I were a little confused by this because we looked at the schedule last week and we were talking about there only being 1 or 2, and then we looked in the schedules. I don't know if they had time zones mixed up or something, but it ends up being they have 4 primetime games, but only one of them is at CenturyLink Field. And NBC's Pro Football Talk, they tweeted about this after the schedule came out last week, that maybe there's a little conspiracy here because as far as what the schedule looks like, Seattle's blown a lot of teams out in primetime games. Last year it was the Saints. They did it to the 49ers 2 years in a row. So they've been consistently having ugly endings in their favor, obviously, but maybe it's hurting the ratings some. And you and I know how we both feel the same way about Roger Goodell. It comes down to money a lot of the time, and maybe he talked to the schedulers and said, well, let's have those primetime games. Seattle's on the road because they're more vulnerable. They're so dominant at home. Let's put them on the road so that maybe the games are closer and we don't have to worry about ratings taking a hit because Seattle ended up winning by 30 points. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Regardless, Seattle has a very difficult schedule. That's going to happen. When you're the Super Bowl champion, you're almost guaranteed definitely a top 10 strength of difficulty schedule. I believe Seattle actually has the 6th most difficult schedule as far as looking at the starting point this season. To touch on that conspiracy theory issue, that's kind of interesting in a sense. And we talked about this, and I do think there is potentially something to that in regards to 3 of the 4 primetime games are away. If you look at last year, Seattle was almost unbeatable at home. They go on the road, and they become a very, very much different team. Not that they were a bad team, but they just were not clicking as much. They get away from CenturyLink Field, and they don't quite have that it factor as much. So I think there's a point, you brought it up earlier, that it's all about money. And the Seahawks were blowing teams out during primetime games. Look at the Super Bowl, for instance. They blew out the Denver Broncos when everyone expected that to either be a close shootout or a low-scoring game. And I think that's a problem for Goodell because he's all about promoting the league. He's talked about expanding a franchise to London. He's all about that bottom line, and that bottom line is green money. So I think from that standpoint, we'll never know because it's never going to come out. No one's ever going to say anything about it. But I think there is a chance that maybe they scheduled the Seattle Seahawks schedule as they did to kind of make a few closer games, and so on and so forth. So the ratings are a little bit higher. If you look at their schedule too, their last 6 games are against teams with 10 wins or more from last season. Some of their primetime games are, against playoff teams. So these games here are not going to be easy, and they definitely have the potential to really draw in the ratings like Goodell wants.
Yeah, and I think if you have a slip-up in the middle of the schedule, because you and I agree with this, the beginning is brutal for the Seahawks. The ending is especially brutal. The 10-win team, 7 games in a row. Now, it's bound to happen a team or two on that list that drops a little bit, but they're still all quality teams. None of those games are going to be gimmies. They're going to be difficult. If Seattle slips up in the middle when they're playing teams like Oakland and they play the Rams in there, if they slip up in there a few times, that could be costly as far as going back to the playoffs because you're looking at that last 7-game stretch. If you go 4-3, that's a success because you got to play the 49ers 2 times in a 3-week stretch, and you know how physical and emotionally toiling those games are. Seattle's going to be in a position where if they get 4-3 there, we'd like to see 5-2, but 4-3 would be successful in that run of games, especially since a lot of the big games this year appear to be on the road away from, say, the matchup with Green Bay and the one matchup with the 49ers. They've got a lot of games that are the bigger ones that are on the road, and that's obviously an influence of the schedule. Seattle did have the 6th toughest schedule last year, and they went 13-3. They have the 6th toughest by percentages again this year. Not saying they're going to go 13-3 again. I would be stunned actually if they did that well, but I can still see an 11-5, 12-4 team coming out of here because the talent is still there. But obviously, there's a lot of roadblocks. Even when the schedule is looking a little easier, there's a lot of roadblocks. We're going to wrap up the show here talking about Russell Wilson. Now, obviously, the Seahawks quarterback last week was in the news for his divorce. We're not going to go through that. That's his business. It seems like there's enough media members that are trying to become involved in that. Who cares? Leave the man alone. It's his business to deal with, not ours. So we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Russell Wilson as a football player. Now, clearly, Tad, Russell Wilson's a winner. He's the winningest quarterback in NFL history for his first 2 seasons. He passed Ben Roethlisberger on that Super Bowl run last year. Statistically, people talk about him being a bottom feeder when it comes to yardage, but that's very misleading. The statistics show that, he's near the bottom in total yards. The dude just doesn't throw the ball near as much, not the volume that some of these other guys do. The efficiency, though, is outstanding. 26 touchdowns each of the first 2 years in the league. He's a guy that doesn't throw a lot of interceptions. He's one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the league. He's really done a great job turning limited opportunities into gaudy numbers. And I think, yardage is nice, but it can be a misleading statistic. Just look at Tony Romo. You and I have talked about that. He's going to put up whopping yardage totals unless he gets hurt every year. But has that really helped him push his team to the next level? It's not completely on Romo, but the interceptions and when he throws them, Wilson doesn't have that problem. He's much more efficient throwing the football. He can get as many chances because the Seahawks run that run-centric offense with Lynch, and Christian Michael's going to become involved in that. So the Seahawks are in a situation where they're not going to ask Russell Wilson to do too much. He gets that game manager tag. You and I view that differently. I think it's misused far too often. For me, Wilson's ability to win games, I don't see him as a guy that just manages stuff. I can see him as a guy that can actually win games when he needs to. That makes him a dynamic leader. The ability to use his legs and his arm. He's got arguably the best work ethic other than Peyton Manning. He'd be right up there as far as quarterbacks go. The dude comes in and watches film all the time. There's plenty of room for him to move up as a quarterback. Looking at what Wilson can improve on, you and I have got a different list of ideas here, and some of them are similar. But looking at areas that Wilson can improve, where do you think he needs to improve most to really make that next leap if you're looking at becoming one of the top quarterbacks in the National Football League?
Well, as you mentioned, Corb, Wilson, statistically he's a bottom feeder, but that's only because of the style Seattle runs. So to have him make that next jump, I think, one, he's going to have to throw more, but that's not really his decision. That's kind of out of his control for the most part. So where I really see him is two issues. He's got taken a lot of sacks at this point in his career and fumbling the ball. Now, this is a twofold problem. The sacks aren't completely his fault. Everyone, is pretty much aware that Seattle's offensive line was on the leaky side last year. At points, they looked like a top-flight unit. But a lot of the time, Russell Wilson, the only reason he wasn't on the ground more was because he's got that athletic scrambling ability to get out of danger. So from that sense, there's nothing he can do about it. On the other hand, though, the one thing I love about Wilson, but at the same time is a downfall with him for this, is he's got that mentality of never quit, never die. And he uses his athleticism to get out of situations, to hold on to the ball a little longer, wait for that guy downfield to open up, which is great. It leads to big plays. It leads to miraculous, spectacular plays. On the other hand, though, when he holds the ball times for too long, that opens him up to extra hits and extra sacks. So what I see him doing, and this is going to take care of the fumbles too, because anybody that watches the game of football probably knows that the quarterback fumbles most often when they get hit from a sack, especially if it's a blindside hit. So what I see Wilson really needing to improve on to move up to that next level is his decision-making in a sense. And it's not because he throws a lot of interceptions, but he needs to learn when he just needs to get down, when he needs to get out of bounds, or just throw the ball away.
When he can throw it out of bounds?
Yeah, sorry. Well, throw it out of bounds or just step out of bounds a little bit. He just needs to find a way to get rid of the ball or give himself up and just live to fight another day. It's that mentality that I like, that he's never going to give up, but he also needs to learn a little bit. And he's young. All young quarterbacks have this issue for the most part. He just needs to learn to fight another day. I think that will help him too, because part of Seattle's problems at times is they're ground and pound, and if they're not in that third and short situation, it's on Russell Wilson, which isn't necessarily a problem, but if he gets sacks, if there's fumbles, you get into 1st and 12, 1st and 15, that makes it a lot harder to convert those first, second, and third downs, and I think that's going to drop his completion percentage, it's going to increase his interceptions, so if he can just improve that decision-making on all areas, basically survive to fight another day, get the ball out of his hand, get rid of it, throw it away. I think that's going to help eliminate sacks. It's going to help eliminate hits on him, and it's going to help eliminate the fumbles. Do all that, and he moves up to that next tier where you're talking, is this guy elite? Has he arrived already in year 3?
Yeah, it's all about experience for Russell Wilson. And when you and I talk about game manager, we view things a little bit differently. Like I said, I think it's a widely misused term. because I look at it this way, and you actually have the same definition, but you and I view it differently as far as Russell Wilson is concerned. I like your definition, actually. A game manager is a QB that plays to not lose the game, essentially. I agree that, and I think it's a label that is put on quarterbacks far too often. And for me, I'm going to make my argument, and I know how you feel about this, but for me, Russell Wilson has too many skills that he can use to actually win games and be the leading man to get it done. When I think game manager, I hate saying this, but Alex Smith is always going to be the first name that comes up to me because I think he has to have great talent around him to really get the job done. If you look, obviously he had all the offensive coordinators in San Francisco. That was a problem. But the big issue for him, I think, comes down to he just isn't talented enough, to carry an offense. I think Russell Wilson can do that. But you have a little bit of a different viewpoint, obviously. You think Wilson fits that mold of a game manager. To a sense, maybe to me he does, but I just think it's a mislabel on him.
I totally agree that, the term game manager is misused. And I'm going to, in a second here, I'm going to make it hopefully very clear why I think he's a game manager in this sense. But I do think the game manager, it's someone who plays not to lose the game. And it's not that they're playing scared. It's just, like you said, they don't have the tools to carry a team consistently on a regular basis. So, and here's my deal with Russell Wilson. I do think he has the tools to, within another year or two, if he's in a pass-heavy offense, if Seattle changes and starts throwing the ball a lot more. Wilson had around 400 attempts this past season. You've got guys like Matthew Stafford throwing 650 or more. So he doesn't have the opportunities. And that's why I see him as a game manager. It has nothing to do with talent whatsoever. I think Wilson is a guy that he is actually able to carry a team. The only reason I see him as a game manager is because that's what he's being asked to do at this point in his career. Now, as he gets a little more experience, I think that might come off. But he's a game manager to me just because of the fact that how Seattle runs their offense. They're asking him to manage the game for the most part. Occasionally asking him to win, but for the most part they ask him, Wilson, go ahead and get us into field goal range, into touchdown range, and that sort of thing. Get us into positions to win the game. They're not asking him to win it for the most part. And that's the only reason I see him as a game manager, because of what he's being asked to do. If he were asked to do more, I think he would be completely capable of doing that. It's just a matter of what the coaching staff is asking him to do that I see him as a game manager. And I think that's where we differ, Corb, in this topic, that, you're seeing it as just, he's got that talent. He's not one. I don't think he is one. I think it's just what he's being asked to do at this point is the difference.
Then you make some valid points. I completely understand that. I respect those points. I think Seattle, they could put more onus on him to win games, but Marshawn Lynch is kind of a star running back, and they like to lean on him. I think down the road, they're not going to shy away from that run-heavy offense necessarily, but I think as Wilson continues to grow as a quarterback, they will put more responsibility in him to win games when he has to. So I think the Seahawks down the road are going to look at that. To me, accuracy is the biggest thing that needs to be improved on, and ironically enough, to me, it's the short to intermediate passing game. I think when you look at his ability to throw the ball downfield, I'd put him in the top 5 or 6 quarterbacks for that. He doesn't get a lot of opportunities, but when he does, he is dangerous. He's lethal. He knows how to lead receivers. He's accurate. He does a great job putting it in a position where his guys can chase after it and get it, and he does a good job for the most part keeping it away from defensive backs and not allowing them to have an interception opportunity. I think he's one of the best there. It's really the short to intermediate game, and I noticed late in the regular season last year, I don't know, part of it to me was the play calling. It seemed like they were running a slant every time they had 3rd and 5 or shorter. They were running the same play, and other teams knew it, but he was missing on slants. It's a hard throw to make, no doubt, but he's got to get that more consistently. And other intermediate throws, the short stuff, that seems to be where he can improve. 63% career passer roughly. He can do better than that. I think he can approach the 70% mark, especially considering that his volume of throws isn't near as much as some of the prolific passers in this league. I think that's the area where he needs to see the most growth. He needs to be more effective in terms of his ability to get the ball to his receivers. They're pretty good about not dropping the football. He's got a good set of hands out there, especially if they draft another reliable receiver in the 1st or 2nd round. It's on him to do a better job getting the ball on target, especially those 5, 10, 15-yard passes. Whereas the deep balls, just keep doing what you're doing, because I think he's one of the best in that area, and that's probably been the most surprising revelation watching Russell Wilson play. I knew he had a big arm, but he's really accurate from long range.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the accuracy issue here, and it's not. I don't mean to say it's an issue, but it's something he can address. The deep. It's obviously it's going to be helped by the running game. You've got Marshawn Lynch pounding the ball, and then you got play action, and teams are going to bite on the play action. So that always helps any quarterback, no matter who you are or your skill set, be more successful in the deep routes. Not to take anything away from Wilson, all because he is undoubtedly accurate. The difference here that I'm seeing as far as short, intermediate routes compared to the deep routes is the deep routes, in my mind, you have a little more wiggle room. Really, on the deep routes, yes, you got to throw over one shoulder or the other, and you can be better at placing the ball. But it's more of a matter, can you lead your receiver properly or not? And Wilson excels at doing that, and I think that's one of the main reasons why his deep ball is so good. He knows how to lead his receivers so they can catch the ball in stride or put them in a position to where they can get to the ball. The issue with the short and intermediate passing game, and I think this is arguably a little bit harder for a lot of quarterbacks, is because you have more guys to deal with, more guys that can swat it away, more guys that can get into throwing lanes and just alter the throws you have to make. And this is the problem a lot of young quarterbacks have that they have to learn, and Wilson seems to be getting there, and I think he'll improve on it, is that if you've got a guy trailing in your receiver's hip pocket, you've got to put it in a very small window. If you put it on your receiver, that corner is probably going to either be able to knock it away at least or maybe even intercept it. So you've got to put it in a very, very tight window, and that's hard to do for some young quarterbacks. So I think if Wilson can improve on that, his completion percentage will go through the roof. And I like what you said about him approaching this 70% mark. I don't think he'll necessarily get there because that's kind of the golden land for quarterbacks, even guys like Brady, Peyton Manning, and that level of talent. Drew Brees as well. Yes, it's difficult to get there, and normally you have to be very good at those short and intermediate passes. So I don't think he'll quite get there just because of the style they play. But I think for his career, I could see him being a 67, 68% passer guy when he improves on those short and intermediate throws and puts the ball on the money. And that's what a lot of quarterbacks have an issue with, especially like the out route, for example. There's no question about Wilson's arm. It is strong, one of the stronger ones in the league. But it's that accuracy on those type of routes that really make or break the receivers a chance to catch the ball.
Yeah, it seems like simple stuff, but I think you and I both agree here. The holding onto the football too long, he's got to be careful about that. He's got to be cognizant of the pass rush coming after him, especially with guys like Robert Quinn for the Rams in division that he's going to see regularly. He's got to understand who's coming after him. He's got to be smarter in those situations. There's so many plays that he can make getting away from guys that not many quarterbacks can make, but at the same time, those fumbles need to be cut down. The interceptions that he throws, for the most part, come on the short routes or when he's chucking one up in desperation time, and every quarterback deals with that. But the accuracy in the short throws and the fumble problems that he's had from holding on to the ball, they sound simple, but those are the two areas. If Russell Wilson can really clean that up, I think he's going to start being in the conversation for guys like Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, the upper echelon of quarterbacks. If Wilson really wants to be in consideration for that, and I don't think he's that far off, even though he doesn't have the volume, if he can find a way to enter the conversation there as far as accuracy is concerned, get his percentage up a little more, he's going to be up there. He's going to be a guy that we're going to be talking about top 5 quarterbacks in the National Football League. And once you get there, just keep working. I think he can stay there for a long time.
Yeah, and I've just got one final point on Wilson here that I'd like to make, and this really is for any young quarterback, this is where it's at. And even for the older quarterbacks, like guys like Peyton Manning, that have been in the league closer to 20 years than not, Wilson, the one thing that he really needs to improve is just experience, and that comes with time because he'll start seeing these things more and more on film. Okay, I missed this receiver because I needed to place it a little bit better. If I put it on his front shoulder instead of his back shoulder on this throw, he's got a chance to catch it. So really, he'll start seeing these things. He'll start realizing, hey, I need to throw the ball away a little bit more and just live to fight another down. So with that experience is going to come the improvement that I think that we both agree that will be there, especially if the volume of throws increases. that's one thing like Andrew Luck's got an advantage on. He's thrown the ball a lot more than Wilson, partially because he's had to, but so he's maybe gotten some of those nuances down that Russell Wilson hasn't quite gotten to yet, just because of the volume of passes. So if Wilson improves upon that, gets a little more experience under his belt, I really think you're going to start seeing accuracy tick up a little bit. The production overall is going to be a lot more efficient, and he's going to be in line to be, as you said, an upper echelon quarterback, probably top 5, definitely top 10 for the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, there's a long trajectory there. Definitely a lot of potential, and Wilson's got the work ethic. He's going to put the time in he needs to, studying and preparing to continue to improve as a quarterback in the National Football League. I have no doubt in my mind that he's going to get there. The question is, how much progress will he make this season? Anyway, it's been an outstanding episode of Seahawks Central Radio. We've enjoyed talking about Seahawks football, as well as the major contract extension for Earl Thomas and draft prospects, and of course the development of Russell Wilson. I'm Corbin Smith alongside Tad Hensinger. We'll see you next week, 12s. Have a good evening, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.